Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about the solved case of Kenia Monge. She was a young woman who went on a night out with friends one evening in 2011 and never returned home. When Kenia disappeared, her family jumped into action straight away to try and find her, and they were of course desperately hoping that they would find her alive and well. But as the weeks and the months went by, that was sadly looking less and less likely. And as the investigation into her case continued, there was one person of interest in particular that seemed to stand out from the others, that seemed to raise the most suspicion. This individual at first appeared to be just a good Samaritan in the case. However, as more evidence was found, the police discovered that they were in fact the complete opposite. But quickly before we get into the case, I would like to say a huge thank you to Surfshark for very kindly sponsoring this section of the video. Surfshark is a VPN, a virtual private networking service, which in a nutshell keeps your online identity safe by making it appear as though you are operating from a different country. A VPN keeps your personal data safe from potential hackers and cyber criminals by masking your IP address and encrypting all of the information sent between your devices and the internet. And as well as the safety aspect, this comes with so many other additional benefits. For example, it means that you can access and unblock content libraries and streaming services from other countries which otherwise wouldn't be available to you, such as different countries' Netflix libraries. I always use the American Netflix to watch one of my favourite TV shows, Grey's Anatomy. We don't have it on the UK Netflix, but it's fine because all I have to do is use Surfshark to change my location to the US and then I can watch it. Surfshark is also so useful for when you go on holiday. If you're travelling to another country but you don't want to miss your favourite TV shows from back home, then again you can just change your virtual location back to where you're from. Surfshark has more than 3,200 servers in 65 countries and they do not monitor, track or store what you do online. They don't keep any connection or activity logs, and their clean web feature blocks ads, trackers and malware and phishing attempts, allowing you to surf the web safely. I highly recommend that you guys check out Surfshark and take advantage of this incredible offer that I'm about to share with you. If you use my code, which is just Molly, you will receive 83% off your Surfshark subscription plus an additional 3 months for free. And Surfshark also offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there is no risk if you just want to try it out. Once again, a big thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you to you guys for always supporting the sponsors on this channel, and now let's just get into the case. Just before we continue, please listen carefully to the following. This video is about the murder of a young woman and it involves heavy themes such as violence towards women, rape, sexual assault and domestic violence. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back to the spring of 2011 in the city of Denver, which is located in the state of Colorado in the US. And this is Kenia Monge. She was 19 years old at the time that this case occurred. She was born on the 26th of January 1992 and she was originally from the country Honduras in Central America. That's where she was born. Her mother Maria was only 15 years old when she had Kenia, and from what I can gather, Kenia's biological father was never really in the picture. I couldn't find his name anywhere online. I don't think he had much to do with his daughter, and you know, being a single parent, a really young single parent, was hard for Maria. She was still a child herself really, and so according to online sources, Maria's mother, so Kenia's grandmother, kind of took hold of the reins during Kenia's early childhood years. She kind of raised Kenia herself. I think Maria felt that that was just what was best for her daughter while she got her own life on track. Maria ultimately ended up moving to the US, I think to Colorado, and it was there where she met the man who would go on to become her husband, a man named Anthony Lee, who mainly went by Tony Lee. They fell in love, they got married, and they had 2 children of their own. They had a daughter who they called Kimberly and a son who they they named Anthony. He was obviously Anthony Jr. And at 12 years old in 2004, Maria's eldest, Kenia, moved over to Colorado and in with her mum and her siblings and obviously her stepfather, Tony. Well, I say stepfather, but really Tony was just her father. Kenia and Tony developed a really, really special bond. They became incredibly close. And so Kenia asked Tony, you know, do I have to call you my stepdad? Because that's not what you feel like to me. You feel like my dad. And Tony felt the same. Even though they weren't biologically related, he felt like Kenia was just his daughter. And so he was more than happy for Kenia to just call him dad. Kenia was also very close with her siblings, Kim and Anthony. She was a very, very good big sister to them. Her father, Tony, said that she enjoyed being the oldest because she liked feeling like the boss. She liked telling Kim and Anthony what to do. Her brother Anthony described Kenia as being just always very happy. She was a joy to be around. Her sister Kim actually described her as being like a bright light because she just made everyone else around her happy. Kenia was kind and trusting, and she and Kim were sisters, obviously, but they were also just like best friends. Kim said that she and Kenia would always talk about literally anything. They felt comfortable enough to tell each other everything and anything because they were so close. The family lived in a city called Aurora in Colorado, which is just east of Denver, and by 19 years old, Kenia Monge was, I believe, in college. She was a student and she studied broadcasting because she dreamed of having a career in like film and TV production. She wanted to be either a director or a producer when she was older. That was her career goal. She had also moved out by this point. By 19, she had moved out of her parents' house and she was living with her boyfriend Leo in an apartment. Alongside college, she also had a job working in customer service to earn her own money. Kenia Monge was just a bright and beautiful young woman who had her whole life ahead of her. But tragically, in the spring of 2011, her life, her future would be snatched away from her when Kenia suddenly disappeared following a night out with friends. It was the evening of the 31st of March 2011, and that night Kenia decided to go on a night out with a couple of her girlfriends. They went to this one bar, and then following this they travelled to lower downtown Denver, where apparently nightlife was the best. There were a lot of different bars and clubs there to go to, and Kenia and her friends were actually going to nightclubs that were for people aged 21 and over, and obviously Kenia was 19, and I think her friends were also around the same age, so they weren't actually allowed in. But they did what a lot of other underage teenagers do, and they used fake IDs to get into these clubs. So that is where Kenia was that night. She was in downtown Denver in a club with friends. It was called the 24K Club. They were just chatting, dancing, having fun, having a couple of drinks, and then all of a sudden Kenia was gone. Now, different sources seem to say different things about this part. Some sources say that at around 11 p.m. that night, Kenia got up from the table in the club where she was sat with friends. She left her purse and her phone at the table and she went to the bathroom. But she never came back. She never returned to her friends, and she didn't tell her friends that she was leaving. Whereas other sources state that Kenia was actually kicked out of the club that night. Bouncers kicked her out along with a man that she was apparently dancing with. They were both kicked out because the bouncers believed that they were too intoxicated. So I think what may have happened is that Kenia did leave her friends to go to the bathroom. She left her belongings at the table with them, and on her way back she started dancing with this man, and that's when she was kicked out. She was kicked out before she could grab her phone and her purse and tell her friends that she was being forced to leave. So at some point she left the club. However, Kenia never made it home that night. Shortly after leaving the nightclub, she just completely disappeared, never to be heard from again. Now, the following morning, the morning of the 1st of April 2011, Kenia's boyfriend Leo woke up and he realised that his girlfriend wasn't home. She never came back to their apartment. He had tried to text her and call her a couple of times to find out where she was, if she was okay, but he got no response, and so concerned, happened, he decided to get in touch with Kenya's family. He rang her younger sister Kimberly to, I guess, find out if perhaps Kenya had gone back to her family home the night before for some reason, but she hadn't. Kim said that she wasn't there and that she hadn't heard from her sister. And at first, Kim actually thought that Leo was trying to play a joke on her. It was the 1st of April, it was April Fool's, and so she thought that Leo was playing a prank and pretending that Kenya was missing. However, he assured her that he wasn't joking. He really had no idea where Kenya was. So Kim got off the phone with Leo and she started ringing around the rest of the family, like her mum Maria and her dad Tony, to find out if maybe Kenya had gotten in touch with them, but she hadn't. They too hadn't heard from her, and so quickly the alarm bells started to ring. The family became very, very worried, and so they decided to pick up the phone and call the police to report Kenya as missing. However, it appears as though the police weren't really willing to jump into action straight away. They basically said to the family, Kenya is 19, she's technically an adult, so her case isn't a top priority, and they believed that she would turn up eventually. They actually said to the family, just wait a couple of days, and then if she's still not home, then we'll launch a proper investigation. Understandably, her family were not happy with that, particularly Kenya's father Tony. He was angry that the police were not taking his daughter's disappearance seriously, and he decided that he could not just wait around. He could not wait and just hope that Kenya would eventually come home. He had to start looking for her himself immediately. So the family started ringing around Kenya's friends. They contacted the girls that Kenya had been out with the previous night, and they told the family that they had no idea where she went. As far as they knew, she literally just went to the bathroom and never came back. And they said that they still had her purse and her phone because Kenya had left it behind. So Tony asked the friends if they could bring Kenya's phone to him because he felt that maybe there was something on her phone that might indicate where she had gone after she left the club. Maybe she had arranged for someone to pick her up, who knows. So the friends did just that. They brought the phone to Tony and he started going through it. He was going through her call history and her text messages, and there was one text message in particular that stood out to Tony. It was a text message that had come through to her phone that morning, I believe, and it was from a guy called Travis, which wasn't a name that Kenya's family recognised. They didn't know of anyone called Travis. And this text read, quote, "Hey, this is Travis, the guy who gave you a ride last night, white creepy van. Did you get home okay?" So instantly it was looking likely that perhaps this Travis person might have some information. His text message stated that he gave Kenya a lift. But a lift where? She didn't return to her family home or her apartment where she lived with her boyfriend, so where did he drop her off? The family needed to find out more, and so straight away Kenya's dad Tony tried to ring this number, Travis's number, but no one picked up. And so he rang again and again and again. He rang countless times and he didn't get an answer until the following day, on the evening of the 2nd of April 2011. So just under 2 days after Kenya was last seen, when finally Travis responded. He rang Kenya's phone back and spoke to her father, Tony, and he confirmed that he gave Kenya a ride in his car in the early hours of the 1st of April. He was a stranger to Kenya, but he said that he was out driving that night. He actually dropped off a friend at their apartment building. It was called the Lofts apartment building in downtown Denver. And he said that it was outside this apartment building where he spotted Kenya. He said that she was kind of stumbling around. It seemed as though she was drunk and she was chatting to a homeless man. And so he decided to ask her if everything was okay. Did she need a lift somewhere? Because he was happy to take her if she did. And she said yes. She said that she needed to get back to her friends that she was with at the club earlier that night because they had her belongings. Travis said that once she got in his car, Kenya used his mobile phone to call her phone in the hopes that her friends would answer, because obviously her her friends had her phone. However, they didn't, and so Kenia asked Travis if he could just drive her to the club because maybe her friends were still there. However, when they got to the club, it was closed, and so Kenia asked if instead he could just drive her home back to her apartment. So he started driving there, and Travis said that during the journey, Kenia started saying that she wanted a cigarette, but he did not smoke. He didn't have any cigarettes on him, and so he pulled into a gas station nearby so that she could go in the store and buy some, although it turns out that the gas station was also closed when they arrived. However, after they pulled into the gas station, Travis claimed that Kenia started speaking to this man, this stranger who was standing nearby. He introduced himself as Dan, and Dan was apparently smoking, and he gave Kenia a cigarette. Travis said that they started chatting to each other in Spanish, and Kenia seemed as though she wanted to stay there with him, and so Travis got back in his vehicle and he left. He just left Kenia there at the gas station, and he went back to his home, and that was the last that he saw of her. So that was Travis's account from that night, and Travis actually said to Tony on the phone, look, I can drive and meet you at the gas station now if you want to go through that night some more. And Tony said yes, he was willing to do anything to try and get answers as to where his daughter was. But also Tony wanted to go and meet Travis because he had his doubts about Travis's story. He was quite suspicious of him because he was a stranger to Kenia, so Tony didn't know what kind of person he was. And also it seemed as though he was the last person to see Kenia that night, so did he really just offer her a lift home as a kind gesture, or was that story a lie? Did he actually have more sinister intentions? Did he have something to do with Kenia's disappearance? Tony actually left his home that evening armed with a gun. He took his gun with him to go and meet Travis, just in case Travis was a dangerous person, just in case he could have been responsible for whatever had happened to Kenia. His wife Maria tried to stop him from taking the gun and going to meet Travis, but Tony was adamant that he was going. Understandably, he didn't really have a clear head. He wasn't thinking straight because his sole focus was to find his daughter and bring her home, and he was willing to do that and get answers by any means necessary. So he left the house and drove to the gas station, and because his wife Maria was so worried about him, she actually called the police and asked them to please meet her husband there because he was armed with a gun and she was scared about what could happen. So the police went straight to the gas station. They actually got there before Tony arrived, and they explained why they were there. They spoke to Tony, and they also spoke briefly with Travis, who had also arrived at the gas station by this point. His full name was Travis Forbes, by the way. I don't think I've said that yet, but yeah, he was called Travis Forbes, and he was 31 years old. The officers spoke with him. They took an initial statement, had a quick look in his vehicle. He had a white van, but they didn't really find anything unusual. And then after this, the officers asked Travis if he was willing to have a quick word with Kenia's father, Tony, because Tony was eager to speak with him. And Travis agreed. I mean, that was why he came. So Tony and Travis spoke. Travis told him the same account that he had told him previously about how he picked Kenia up that night and later left her at the gas station with that guy, Dan. And he actually apologized to Tony. He said that in hindsight, he felt bad for leaving Kenia with Dan because maybe it was this Dan that was responsible for her disappearance. At the time, he didn't think about whether Dan could be a dangerous person. He just thought that Kenia would be fine, and so he left. So it seemed as though Travis didn't really have the answers that Tony and the family were looking for, and so the search just continued for Kenia. Her friends created missing posters with her face on, and they were distributed around the local area, obviously in the hopes that someone would spot her somewhere and get in touch to provide her location. And about 4 days after she vanished, that is when the police investigation into her disappearance properly began. Finally, the police were actually going to start their own search for her. In fact, I believe even the FBI became involved with the case at this point, and they started looking more into the people in Kenia's life, trying to determine whether someone she actually knew personally could have had involvement in whatever had happened to her. Of course, one of the very first people that they looked at was her boyfriend, Leo. He was a suspect in the very beginning of this case because he was her partner, and in many, many disappearance and murder cases, the perpetrator is the victim's partner. And also, apparently Leo and Kenia did not really have the best relationship. As I understand it, it could be quite toxic at times, so maybe Leo could have had a possible motive for wanting to do something to Kenia. So Leo was brought into the police station, he was interviewed, he denied having any knowledge about what happened to Kenia after she left the club that night. They had to look through his phone and they could see that he had been calling and texting Kenia on the night that she went missing, asking where she was, when she would be home, was she okay, etc, etc. And the detectives never really found any evidence to suggest that he was lying, so I think ultimately the boyfriend was pretty much ruled out of their inquiry. Now, as part of their investigation, something that the detectives started trying to do was obtain any CCTV footage of Kenia from that night. Did any cameras in the area spot her? Because then that might give them an indication as to where she might have gone. They wanted to trace her last steps. Now, if you recall, Travis Forbes said that he picked Kenia up outside of the Lofts apartment building in downtown Denver that night. So they decided to have a look through the footage from the building's security camera, and sure enough, she was spotted on it. Just after 2 a.m. on the 1st of April, Kenia was captured walking into the apartment building with a man. An unidentified man. So who was this man, and why was Kenia with him that night? Could he have been involved in her disappearance? It was ultimately determined that this man lived in the apartment building. The police identified him as being Chad Davis, and it turns out actually that Chad was the man that Kenia was kicked out of the nightclub with that evening. Remember, they were kicked out by the bouncers because they felt that they were too drunk, and clearly after they were kicked out, Kenia went with this guy. She went with Chad to his apartment nearby. The CCTV captures them heading in the direction of Chad's apartment. However, when Chad was later questioned by the police, he said that Kenia wasn't in there for long. She literally went in to use his bathroom and then she left. And the CCTV did back this up. She was spotted leaving the apartment building alone, literally only about 3 minutes after arriving. So Chad didn't appear to have anything to do with her disappearance because she left his apartment on her own. Kenia was captured on CCTV again just outside of the apartment building. She was seen chatting to a homeless man nearby. Following this, she was spotted again on a hotel's surveillance camera. This hotel was just opposite the apartment building. She went into the hotel, used their bathroom, then left, and then crossed the road and went back to just outside the Lofts apartment building, where she was seen again chatting to this homeless guy, and this was around 2:35 a.m. Now, according to Travis Forbes' version of events, this was when he pulled up outside of the apartment building after having dropped a friend off, and he spotted Kenia and offered her a lift, and she accepted. Everything seems to lead back to Travis Forbes. He still seemed to have been the last person to see her that night. So he was brought into the police station to give a full statement. He talked the police through what happened, what he had already told Kenia's father, Tony. He said that he left Kenia at the gas station and that he just went home after that. And his girlfriend confirmed that. The police also spoke to Travis's girlfriend. Her name was Kerry. And she confirmed that he came home at the time that he said he did, after he left the gas station that night. Travis also gave a description of Dan. If you remember, Dan was the guy that he left Kenia with that night at the gas station. He was the guy who gave Kenia a cigarette and she started chatting to. He said that Dan was young, he was Asian, and that he spoke Spanish. So now the police had the task of trying to find this Dan, just in case he was responsible for Kenia's disappearance. So the description of Dan provided by Travis was released to the public and the media, obviously in the hopes that someone would know who he was and come forward with his full name. However, before anything really came of this line of inquiry, there was a sudden turn of events in the case when just 5 days after Kenia disappeared, the police received a call from a member of the public. This call was from a woman named Monica Paul, and she owned a bakery in Denver. It was called Debbie's Bakery or DB's Bakery, and Travis Forbes actually worked there. He apparently rented some space at this bakery because he made and sold granola bars. That was his line of work. And when Monica had a look through the CCTV footage from the bakery over like the last week, she found some footage of Travis that was quite alarming to her, that she thought might have been of interest to the police. I think by this point in the case, it was well known that Travis was supposedly the last person to see Kenia on the night that she vanished. This whole case was obviously all over the news, and actually Travis himself had done a couple of TV interviews about how he offered Kenia a ride home that night, about how he wished he did more to help her. Honestly, he seemed to be almost enjoying the media attention that this was all getting him. So Monica would have known of Travis's involvement with this case, but when she looked over the CCTV footage from the bakery on the same day that Kenia went missing, she started to think that maybe he had a lot more involvement in Kenia's disappearance than he was letting on. At around 7:30 p.m. on the 1st of April, so later the same day that Kenia disappeared, Travis was captured on the CCTV camera walking into the bakery storeroom with a big white cooler box. He's rolling it in, and on the footage you can see that the cooler box has been taped shut. There is black duct tape secured around it to keep it closed. He rolls this cooler into the storeroom and then he takes it into the big walk-in freezer and leaves it in there. And following this, Monica noticed on the footage that every single time someone else from the bakery went into the walk-in freezer, Travis was always there, just watching, just observing what they were doing. And then shortly after this, the surveillance camera was suddenly switched off. Someone unplugged it, and that someone was Travis. Monica checked the CCTV footage from the camera in her office, and she saw Travis walking into the office with latex gloves on and pulling out the plug. It seemed as though whatever he was about to do next, he didn't want anyone to see, so he made sure that there was no footage of it. So after finding this CCTV footage, Monica contacted the police, and the detectives had a look through the footage, and they too thought that this was extremely suspicious, and so they conducted a search of the bakery to see if they could find any evidence, maybe even find Kenia, because perhaps it was her body that was inside of that white cooler box, and that's why Travis duct taped it shut, because he didn't want anyone to open it. Now, as I understand it, they did find the white cooler in the bakery, but when they opened it, there was nothing inside. Nothing apart from a very, very strong smell of bleach, indicating that it had recently been meticulously cleaned. According to a True Crime Daily documentary that I watched about this case, forensics did find one human cell on the drain plug of this cooler, but that was it. That was all they found. I mean, by this point it had been many days since Kenia vanished, so if her body was previously in that cooler, Travis had had plenty of time to move her elsewhere by the time the police were searching the bakery. So there was nothing in this cooler. However, just behind the back of the bakery store, the police did find a barrel, and there were like ashes and the remnants of a fire inside of this barrel. So the police sifted through the remnants and they found what looked like some clothing. It was clothes that had been burned in this barrel. They found a zipper and also some black material, and this made alarm bells ring instantly, because on the night that Kenia disappeared, she was wearing a black dress. So the discovery of this evidence and of the CCTV footage really shifted the entire focus of this investigation to Travis Forbes, the man who had been trying to make out like he was just this good Samaritan who was trying to help Kenia that night. He was just trying to help her get home. But clearly that was all a lie. The evidence now indicated that he did something to Kenia that night, that he possibly murdered her. Travis's white van was also searched by the police, and although they didn't necessarily find any solid evidence in there, they did notice that there was a hell of a lot of dirt and mud on his tyres, indicating that he may have recently driven to a rural area like a woodland or field or something, and perhaps this was where he buried Kenia's body. But as well as that, they also noticed that the inside of his van was incredibly clean. Again, just like the cooler box, there was a very, very strong smell of bleach, which is something that Kenia's father, Tony, actually noticed when he met Travis. If you recall, he went to meet him at the gas station a couple of days after Kenia vanished, and Tony observed then that Travis's van smelled like bleach and cleaning chemicals. And as well as that, they could tell that a new carpet had recently been laid in this van. The old one had been ripped up and a new one had been put in. So evidence is really starting to mount against Travis Forbes, and he was now the police's #1 suspect in the case. I mean, when they took a look at his background, that in itself was enough to concern the police. It turns out that Travis Forbes had a lengthy criminal history. He'd been arrested and convicted before for crimes such as burglary, criminal harassment, carrying a dangerous weapon, assault, and apparently at the time that this case occurred, he was on probation after being charged with domestic violence. So that in itself was quite telling for the police. However, as the investigation into him continued, before the police could even really properly question him, Travis Forbes himself actually went missing. Just weeks after Kenia's disappearance, he disappeared himself. It seemed as though he had fled. He'd maybe gone on the run. Perhaps he realised that the police were onto him, and so he made a run for it. So now not only were detectives still looking for Kenia, they were looking for her suspected killer. Now, as part of the ongoing search efforts for Kenia, the police obtained Travis Forbes' cell phone records, and they tracked where his phone had gone in the days following Kenia's disappearance. And it was determined that after Kenia vanished, Travis had travelled to an area called Keensburg in Colorado, which is just over 40 miles away from Denver. And apparently there is a lot of farmland in Keensburg, so police began thinking that perhaps Travis may have buried Kenia's body somewhere there, and so search efforts began in this area. Meanwhile, the hunt for Travis continued. The police were still trying to track him down, but this was going to be hard because he hadn't fled in his white van, probably because he knew that the police would be able to trace it. They'd know to be on the lookout for it. So they had no idea where he was, where he'd gone, where he was hiding. That was until early May of 2011. More than a month after Kenia Monge's disappearance, when the police were contacted by an ex-girlfriend of Travis Forbes. She rang the police to report a crime. She told them that Travis had literally stolen her vehicle, her SUV, and took off with it. So now the police knew what car he was driving, and they put out a BOLO, a be on the lookout nationwide alert, so that other police forces in the country knew that Denver police were looking for this specific car, which had been stolen by a man named Travis Forbes. And literally just hours after that BOLO was released, the car was found. It was tracked to Austin in Texas. The car was pulled over and Travis was arrested, and he was currently being held in custody in Austin. So the detectives working on Kenia's case travelled to Texas, and when they arrived, they tried to interview Travis. However, he would not say anything, and he requested a lawyer, which of course he was granted. That is his right to ask for a lawyer. However, the detectives were able to obtain a warrant for a DNA sample from him. He was legally required to give a DNA sample. So his DNA was taken and he was charged with auto theft, and he was extradited back to Jefferson County in Colorado, where he was going to be housed. And I'm sure that this would have been a relief for the detectives, at least whilst they continued with building their case against him and they continued the search for Kenia. They had peace of mind knowing that this potentially very dangerous man was off the streets. Although, unfortunately, it didn't stay that way for long, because you see, just the month following this, in late June of 2011, Travis's ex-girlfriend, the one that he stole the SUV from to drive to Texas, she decided to actually drop the charge of auto theft against him for some reason. So now the police couldn't hold him. He had to be released from jail. They didn't have enough to charge him with anything in relation to Kenia's case because they still had no clue where she was. They didn't even know whether she was dead or still alive and out there somewhere. So yeah, he was let out, and shortly after his release, there was a huge tragic development in this case when a young woman was brutally attacked and left for dead. And it seemed as though her case may have possibly been linked to this one, to Kenia's case. It was the 4th of July 2011, and that evening a 30-year-old woman named Lydia Tillman was out celebrating the holiday. She went to a fireworks display celebration in downtown Fort Collins in Colorado. Fort Collins is over an hour's drive away from Denver. So Lydia went to this fireworks display. She had a really nice time, and then later that evening she started to walk back home alone. She was walking back to her apartment, but what she didn't know at the time was that a man, a stranger, was watching her. She was being followed back to her address, and when she arrived back to her apartment, I think literally as she was opening her apartment door, this stranger came up behind her. He pushed Lydia into her apartment and he walked in after her and shut the door. She was now trapped by this man. He then proceeded to rape Lydia, and she was trying to fight him off. She was trying to fight back, but he was able to overpower her. And to try and stop her from fighting back, the man started literally beating her. He just started punching her over and over again in the head, to the point where her jaw was just completely shattered. Some sources state that he also strangled Lydia, and then he grabbed some bleach. He poured bleach all over her and all over the apartment, and then he lit a match and let the place go up in flames, and then he fled the scene. He left Lydia in there to die, but thankfully by some miracle she didn't. Despite the severity of her injuries, Lydia was able to get herself up and out of the apartment. She actually jumped out of a second-story window, and in doing so she broke both of her ankles. And I think as the police and the paramedics were arriving at the scene, Lydia suffered a stroke. She was rushed to the hospital where she went into a coma, and she was in that coma for weeks just fighting for her life. This was such a brutal, violent attack that she had been the victim of. But as she was in her coma, obviously the police began trying to solve this crime, trying to figure out who did this to her. And underneath Lydia's fingernails, they were actually able to detect traces of her attacker's DNA from where she had tried to fight him off. So this DNA evidence was collected and sent to the science lab for testing. Now, where Lydia's attack potentially links in with Kenia Monge is that the detectives working on Lydia's case had heard that the Denver detectives working on Kenia's case had been surveilling the prime suspect in her disappearance, Travis Forbes, after his release from jail not long before the attack on Lydia. If you recall, he was released in late June of 2011 after the charge of auto theft was dropped, and after he was released, the police put him under surveillance for a couple of days just to keep tabs on him, see where he went after his release. And it turns out that he went to Fort Collins in Colorado, where some of his relatives lived. He decided to stay with them. So he was in Fort Collins, he was in the area where Lydia Tillman lived, and was attacked. The detectives working on Lydia's case heard about this. They heard that he was in the area. They heard that he was a suspect in the disappearance of another young woman. And so they started to think that maybe he could have been Lydia's attacker. Maybe Travis Forbes was the one who raped her and tried to kill her that night. So yeah, they got in touch with the detectives from Denver who were investigating Kenia's case, and they said, look, we think that these two cases could be linked. And remember, the Denver detectives had Travis's DNA. They were able to obtain DNA samples from him when he was arrested in Austin in Texas, and the Fort Collins detectives had the DNA of Lydia's attacker. So Travis's DNA was sent to the lab to be compared against the DNA found underneath Lydia's fingernails. In the meantime, whilst they waited for the results to come back, Travis Forbes was put under surveillance once again. At this point, he was still staying in Fort Collins, and what's so creepy is that one evening, whilst undercover police were watching him, they noticed that he was walking along a street very close to this young woman. It looked like he was following her. He eventually started chatting to this woman and they were walking side by side, and of course the police were so worried about this. They couldn't let him go off with this woman because who knows what his intentions were. So a police officer decided to step in and just kind of try to separate them, try to get this woman to keep moving on her own as the officer was speaking to Travis. And as they were speaking to him, they asked Travis what his name was. However, he did not say Travis Forbes. He gave over a fake name. Apparently he said his name was Travis Kennedy. Eventually the officer let Travis go. As I said, they just wanted to step in momentarily so that they could subtly get this woman away from him. However, when he left, when they let him go and the surveillance team continued watching him, he just started doing it again. They spotted Travis following another young woman and they decided then, okay, we need to get him off the streets. This is a man who is suspected of being responsible for the disappearance of one young woman and the attempted murder of another. They cannot take chances with him. They cannot risk him attacking someone else, and so they decided to arrest Travis that same night for providing false information, i.e. giving that police officer a fake name instead of his real name. And shortly after he was arrested and taken back to jail, the detectives heard back from the science lab. They were informed that the DNA underneath Lydia's fingernails was indeed an exact match to Travis Forbes, confirming that the police were right. He was her attacker. And I believe when she eventually came out of her coma after about 5 weeks, Lydia herself was able to pick Forbes out as being the man that raped and tried to kill her that night. So Travis Forbes was charged with attempted murder, and the month following this, in late August of 2011, he was questioned by the Denver detectives about Kenia Monge's disappearance because, of course, they were still trying to find her, and they knew by this point that Travis had the answers. He knew her whereabouts, and it seemed as though he was finally willing to share those answers with the police. He was finally willing to be honest about his true involvement in Kenia's case. He sat down with the detectives and he confessed to the murder of Kenia Monge. And he said that he would take them to the place where he disposed of her body on one condition, or two conditions, I should say. Travis said that he would tell them exactly what he did to Kenia and exactly where she was, as long as they, number one, did not give him the death penalty, and number two, did not give him the label of a sex offender. He clearly knew that he was going to prison for the rest of his life, and he did not want the sex offender label because he knew full well what happens to sex offenders in prison. They are very much a target for violence from other inmates. In fact, according to a couple of sources, he said to the detectives, this is a direct quote, "If I go to prison a sex offender, I'm fucked." And so the detectives, desperate to find Kenia and finally get some answers for her family, agreed to his terms. And on the 7th of September 2011, more than 5 months after she disappeared, Travis went with the police. He directed them to where he left her body. He told them to drive to a remote area under a small grove of trees near an interstate in Keensburg in Colorado, which, if you recall, the police had already spent some time searching Keensburg previously for Kenia. They thought that this may have been the place where she was buried, because his phone record showed that he drove to Keensburg in the days after she went missing. So they drove out to this specific area in Keensburg. They got out of the car and Travis walked with them to this specific spot, claiming that Kenia was buried near some trees. And when one of the detectives walked closer to this area, Travis started crying and getting hysterical, and he told the detective to take 2 steps right. And then he said, "There, you are now standing on top of her grave." So the detectives called for the forensic teams to come to the area and they began digging up the ground until eventually they found Kenia. She was buried about 5.5 feet underneath the soil. She was in the fetal position, and some sources also state that she was wrapped in a plastic tarpaulin sheet. Following the discovery of her body, her family were obviously informed and of course were absolutely devastated. I mean, Kenia had been missing for more than 5 months at this point. It was looking likely that this was the direction that the case was headed, but I'm sure for her family they must have just been holding on to that tiny bit of hope that maybe she was okay, maybe she was alive and out there somewhere. So to finally receive the news that actually that wasn't the case, that she was dead and that she had been murdered, I can't imagine just how painful that must have been for them. After pointing out the spot to where he buried Kenia, Travis Forbes was then taken back to the police station where he told the detectives everything, exactly what happened on the night that she disappeared and was killed. So Travis said that that night, obviously in the early hours of the morning, on the 1st of April 2011, he came across Kenia on the side of the road outside of the Lofts apartment building like he originally claimed. He pulled up outside the apartment building and he noticed that Kenia was drunk and that she was chatting to a homeless man, and so he offered her a lift home in his van. And I think he claimed that initially that was his intention. He didn't offer her a lift with the intention of killing her. He really was just going to take her home. But I mean, who knows if that was really true or not. He could have just been lying about that. Anyway, Kenia accepted this lift. She got into Travis's van and he said that during the journey, he noticed that Kenia had passed out. She'd fallen asleep. And so he saw this as an opportunity to rape her in his car. He pulled over, climbed on top of Kenia, started to rape her. And he said that as he was doing this, she woke up and of course started to panic. She was scared. So she started trying to push Travis off of her. She was trying to fight him off. And so to stop her, he put his hands around her neck and started strangling her. And he strangled Kenia until she was dead. After she was dead, Travis said that he put Kenia's body in the big white cooler box, which I think he kept in the back of his van. He put her in the cooler, taped the cooler shut, and then he took it to the bakery where he worked. And as we know, he was caught on CCTV rolling the cooler into the walk-in freezer. I think he put her in there to kind of buy himself some time whilst he figured out what to do next. After putting her in the freezer, he obviously unplugged the CCTV camera so that what he did next would not be captured. He said that after unplugging the camera, he took Kenia's body back out of the cooler, he took off all of her clothing and he burnt it in the barrel that the police later found. He said that he did this to dispose of the evidence. Following this, Travis said that he cleaned Kenia's body with bleach, again to get rid of any evidence, probably to get rid of his DNA on her body. After cleaning her, he put her body back in his van and then he later drove out to that rural area in Keensburg where he dug a grave and buried her. And then the cover-up began. He cleaned the cooler box with bleach, he cleaned his van with bleach, he ripped up the carpet and put a new one down. He sent that fake text message to Kenia's phone asking if she got home okay to try and cover his tracks. He made up that fake story about leaving Kenia at that gas station with a man named Dan, a man who clearly did not exist. Travis made him up, and obviously he just hoped that people would buy it. He tried so desperately hard to get away with this, but thankfully he was unable to do so, and after his confession he was charged with first-degree murder. His girlfriend Kerry was also actually charged in relation to this case. If you remember from earlier on in the video, she basically provided Travis with an alibi. She confirmed his initial story that he returned home after just leaving Kenya at the gas station. She confirmed that he returned home at the time he said he did, which was a lie. She lied for him. I don't know if she actually knew what he did that night, whether he confessed to her, but regardless, she provided him with a false alibi. And so she was charged and convicted of perjury, attempting to influence a public official, and false reporting to the authorities. And she was sentenced to spend 60 days in prison and 4 years of supervised probation. And when she got out of prison, she was ordered to seek mental health counselling and also complete 2,000 hours of community service. Travis, on the other hand, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for what he did to Kenia Monge. He also pleaded guilty to the attempted murder of Lydia Tillman, and for that charge he was given an additional 48 years. So he was never ever going to be free again, thank God. As I mentioned earlier on, Lydia was in a coma for a number of weeks following the attack. She was in such a bad way that doctors didn't even expect her to survive, but thankfully she did. She was unfortunately left with some damage to her brain and her throat, which made it more difficult for her to speak. But from what I can tell, she has never let that hold her back. According to sources, within 2 years of the attack, she pushed herself to start working again. She got herself a part-time job. She eventually started traveling. She started studying yoga, and she became a full-time yoga instructor. And I also read that she works closely with the Colorado Police Department to teach women self-defense, which is incredible. What a brave and just truly inspiring woman. In the aftermath of this case, Kenya's family set up an organisation called the Kenia Monge Foundation, and as stated on their website, the Kenia Monge Foundation is a Colorado non-profit foundation established in loving memory of Kenia Monge, a young woman who was the victim of a violent crime resulting in her death and the delay of the discovery of her remains until 5 months later. To honour her legacy, the Kenia Monge Foundation exists to provide women and children in Colorado with resources, education and funding to engage in safe, healthy and productive behaviours and activities in the community. In addition, the Kenia Monge Foundation will provide the families of victims of violent crime and families of missing victims with the emotional, physical and financial support they need to survive the tragic event, which is just amazing. I think it's so incredible that they've been able to create something so positive out of this tragedy, and it's all in Kenya's name. Kenya's little sister Kimberly actually spoke in a documentary that I watched about how after Travis Forbes was convicted, she decided to write to him in prison. I can imagine that she felt like she wanted to just get things off of her chest and say what she needed to say to him. And one of the things that she said to him was actually that she prays for him. She prays for him every night and that she hopes he finds God. And he did write back to Kimberly. He wrote her this very long letter, which Kimberly said was incredibly dark. I'll read a section of the letter to you now. So here is a quote. Travis said, "When I look deep into my soul, there are just too many unlovely truths, and that hard dark thing that lives there can't bear the light. I am ugly and bitter. Most men have a cup full of darkness in them. I have a raging river of it. Boundless and bleak, draw a picture of my soul and it would be a scribble with fangs." He also said, quote, "I murdered your sister because I was a weak and cowardly man. Evil has no mysterious depths. It is not any more complicated than that. Evil acts are simple and empty." Kenya's father Tony has expressed how he believes that there are a lot more victims of Travis Forbes out there that we just don't know about. Tony even says that he thinks Travis Travis is probably a serial killer. He believes that he killed before Kenia and that he's just never been linked to those crimes, which is a terrifying thought. I just hope to God that if that is true, if he did have more victims, then he will face justice for those crimes soon. And I'm so glad that he got life without parole, because the thought of this man ever being released is just so frightening. But that is it for this case. That is the case of Kenia Monge. A devastating case. Kenia was so young, just 19 years old, barely even an adult. She was just a young woman trying to have fun and enjoy her life, and it was cruelly taken away from her by a monster. But yeah, that is it for this video. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think. Also, feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye.